form little micro networks in the human rights world. And often, more broadly, I think we don't have any single database or single place to look when you try to reach out to find who the alumni are and what they're doing. So this is one step in that direction. And in the process of inviting, we've been reaching out to make sure we know who people are, where they are, learn more about what they're doing so that we can showcase it. In a minute, I'll turn things over to Alice Henkin to say a few words. But let me reflect a bit on where we are and where we've come from in terms of our practical training in human rights at Columbia. Because many people know, human rights at Columbia has really been Columbia has been central to the development of a human rights curriculum in law school in the United States, and an engaged kind of teaching that links up with activism. And when I came back to Columbia after having been a student here, I came back with a real sense that I was coming to a place where human rights was part of the mainstream. On the one hand, something that was well accepted within the academic curriculum and pursued in a variety of ways, some of which weren't labeled human rights. And at the same time, I was coming to Columbia because when you work and live in New York City in an area like this, you can't really get too cocky about what you do and what you know about it. Because right outside your door are the people who are living in this world and are creating it in new ways that are unexpected. Now, one of those things is slightly less true today than the other. And that is the mainstream nature, the mainstreamness of human rights at Columbia. And some of it is unavoidable. With the death of Professor Henkin and the departure of some other faculty, we've lost a founding generation in our links to the human rights movement that really emerged professionally in the United States in the 1970s and 1980s. It's been replaced in part. We have wonderful faculty like Sarah Cleveland. We've been successful in bringing in people like Olivier de Scooter to teach on a regular basis. And we have some of our regular faculty otherwise, like Mark Berenberg or Kendall Thomas, Suzanne Goldberg, Katerina Pistor, who are doing phenomenal work, again, sometimes labeled human rights, sometimes not, but pushing the boundaries in terms of what our work is. But sometimes I do think that our school loses track of how central human rights has been in terms of the development of its own perspectives on international law, on the curriculum of law, and its influence in other parts of the world. And I hope that we, the human rights alumni, and I include myself in this, of Columbia, can bring that message back to the school as part of the process. So there are several milestones that I think we can note at this moment as we move on. I've mentioned that we're here to celebrate the completion, in part, of a case that's occupied and educated the human rights students at Columbia for the last 6 years, the case of Jessica Gonzalez. For me, this year marks the 8th year that I'm at Columbia, which means that it's the job that I've held the longest of my life. It's also, I noted that last year I had to get my 3rd yellow fever vaccine, which means that I've been working professionally in Africa for 20 years and moving into my 3rd generation. It also means that as a result, I'm just that guy at Columbia, where before, when I started, I moved from the activist world into the academic world. I was someone who knew what was happening in the activist world and had some legitimacy in bringing that to students. And then when I came to Columbia, I was that guy who left Harvard to come to Columbia. But now I've really just been here, and my own claims to knowing what's happening with the movement are more are less confident and less strong. And I rely on the alumni as well to come back and to tell us where we are and where the movement is going. Each year when I start to teach, I have something of a crisis about that, because to look out at the human rights movement and its diversity is to see a movement that has transformed itself greatly since the end of the Cold War. If you go back to the criticisms of human rights that were coming out from left and from right at the end of the 1980s, you'll see human rights criticized for not taking on serious issues affecting whole parts of the population, women, for example, in general, economic and social rights, business and human rights issues, being able to look at issues of the economy more generally. Human rights in the United States, a field that was barely touched upon a decade ago. Now, all of those areas have been filled in part by the major human rights organizations that are labeled as human rights organizations, and in part as well by new kinds of organizations, sometimes which don't even use the language of human rights. I know that when I go to the World Bank to do advocacy, I know that I'm motivated by my human rights commitments, but sometimes I'm a little tempted to remove the words human rights from my title. And there are organizations that have emerged that I think are doing phenomenal human rights work, like Global Witness, where we have alumni, or others of the Oxfams, or other the development organizations which don't even use the words human rights. So tremendous changes have come. The gaps have been filled by organizations labeled as human rights, organizations not labeled as human rights. But now there's a new critique as well, and it comes from left and right, that story of expansion is a story of opportunism, and not necessarily a response to actual needs, nor necessarily a response to building a coherent movement around human rights. And I think that's a challenge that I have as a teacher, is to try and understand what that is and whether there is that coherence. And for that, again, I turn to the alumni and I turn to those who are in human rights to tell us about what human rights has come to mean. So, in that regard, we're going to hear first from Henkin for a few minutes, and then from 4 human rights practitioners who are alumni of Columbia. And they are going to talk about their work in human rights, relate that to the human rights movement more generally, and maybe by the end give us a bit of advice for how they'd like to see Columbia participate into the future. So let me say a couple of words of introduction of Alice Henkin. She is, as I think you all know, an attorney who has been working in international human rights for many years. She began the Justice and Society program 23 years ago at the Aspen Institute to convene leaders from different disciplines and professions to help shape U.S. policies regarding human rights, international law, transnational justice, and multilateral peacekeeping field operations. Previously, Alice chaired the Association of the Bar of the City of New York Committee on International Human Rights, and she's a former vice president of the association. She's written extensively on human rights, transitional justice, and human rights and multilateral peacekeeping. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a board member of Human Rights Watch. I've encountered her over the years in that role at Human Rights Watch and found her always wise and sage in the advice that she's given the organization and its researchers. Alice.
It's a pleasure and even more an honor to be here to celebrate Columbia Law School Human Rights Clinic. You all who have been involved in the clinic are heroes in my book. But there's more work to be done. And I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about the future work in the human rights area. And let me begin with quoting my husband. I don't think any, certainly not many, and maybe not any of you have been students of Rouge, but I hope that several of you have read his work and come across the following. This is a quote. In the Cathedral of Human Rights, the United States is more like a flying buttress than a pillar. Choosing to stand outside the international structure supporting the international human rights system, but without being willing to subject its own conduct to the scrutiny of that system. And I think we, end quote, I think we have moved into that new realm. Not entirely successfully. When I say we, I mean the United States, has still refused to ratify the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. The fact that these two covenants, political and civil rights and economic and social rights, were separate, had to do with the political situation many, many years ago. They are, in my view, absolutely self-dependent. And not self-dependent on each other. Lou used to walk around with the Universal Declaration in his pocket, hoping it would sort of spread out. And more than 60 years ago, President Franklin Roosevelt, in his Four Freedoms, spoke about the freedom from want. Health, housing, education. We're not there. And I think there's a job to be done on the part of human rights advocates, on the part of human rights lawyers. There's a need to educate U.S. judges, federal and state. By and large, I'd say U.S. judges, some smart, some not so smart, know nothing about this. And they need to be brought up to date. They are beginning to realize that some of the cases on their own docket could benefit from this information. Law clerks are very important. There ought to be an effort to educate judicial law clerks in this field. I think that's a job for the advocates and in particular for the legal advocates. However, let's not give up on the flying buttress piece of the cathedral. It's important to keep on working abroad, whether in Cambodia, Thailand, Kazakhstan. We have to be careful not to come in as Americans telling them what human rights is all about. We have to work very carefully with local groups. There are local groups in all of these places. We have to support them, encourage them, and work with them, not on our own. I want to say another word about corporate lawyers, because I assume that not all of you have jobs in human rights. One, they're hard to get, and some of you may need money. I don't think that corporate lawyers who have been involved in human rights need to give it up. They can continue to be advocates, both in terms of pro bono services, in terms of being spokespersons for human rights causes. There should not be a divide between the human rights lawyers, professional human rights lawyers, and corporate lawyers who have the education they got at Columbia about this field. I wish all of you a great future, and so you will have it. And it's a pleasure to be here and to meet you.
Thank you. So, didn't actually warn any of you as to who would be going first. We'll hear from each of our speakers for about 10 minutes. Don't look at you. How about Chris? We'll start with Chris in terms of here. So every one of the panelists here is a graduate of the clinic since I came here, except for Ramzi, who managed to who came before my time. So I can't take credit for him, nor can the clinic itself. But why don't we start, Chris, with you? Because I think I didn't do Ramzi in time. You didn't have the chance to even prepare beforehand. But a few words about your work and about where it fits in the human rights movement. You can do it sitting or standing.
I'll just stay here if that's all right. I work as a researcher at Human Rights Watch, where I've been for about 7 years now, since I graduated from here in 2004. I started off there as a fellow. I got the Sandler Fellowship, which is the one that's only open to recent graduates of Columbia, and stayed on since then. I started off in their Africa division, where I worked for a number of years, alternately covering the Horn of Africa and Nigeria. And then a couple of years ago, I moved into our Business and Human Rights program, which is where I am now. And I think I'll talk mostly just about kind of what I'm doing now and try to make that relevant to some of the other things Peter suggested that we talk about as well. We're a very small part of the organization. And in some ways, what we do is largely similar to what everybody else at Human Rights Watch does, in that most of our work is really focused on trying to do credible research and reporting on what we see as for one reason or another, important examples of some of the key human rights issues that crop up in the business world and the way that governments and businesses relate to each other. But I think in a lot of ways we're a little bit different than the other parts of the organization, and different from a lot of other kind of human rights research and reporting, just by virtue of the subject matter we focus on. For one thing, we spend a lot of our energy focused on dealing with companies as opposed to governments, which are in a lot of ways really different actors. In some ways easier to influence, in some ways harder, and much harder to sort of pin down into groups that actually are sort of influenced by the same things. Some of the work that we do really does focus pretty narrowly on the conduct of individual companies or individual operations, either because something really serious is going on or because a particular company is of such importance in the industry that it works in that having some influence on it or exposing bad behavior on its part, we hope will have some kind of broader impact, and also make the case in a broader sense for why companies actually need to be overseen and regulated better than they are. And we end up spending a lot of time engaging directly with the companies that we research and write about, and often have a lot better access than we can get with some of the governments that we try to influence. And that's partly, I think, because companies are sort of by nature much more concerned with the potential PR impacts of the work that we do than governments are. The reports that we put out on governments, often it sort of creates an initial media splash, and if the government is savvy enough, it'll just sit there and wait it out and then carry on as before. Whereas companies often tend to react to the prospect of bad press with a kind of a more real sense of panic. And in some cases at least respond to that by being willing to give access and being willing to actually talk about what it is that we think they should be doing. And in some cases actually trying to take measures proactively before we come out with something so that they can point to something they've done when the bad press sort of actually happens. The other side of that, I guess, is that we also spend a great deal of time trying to use our work to illustrate what we think is really the key point, which is that at the end of the day, NGO research and reporting on companies is absolutely no kind of viable way to monitor the conduct of the business world or even any one small part of it, and that there is a really profound lack of any kind of meaningful government oversight or regulation of what companies actually do in human rights terms, at least when they operate outside of their own borders, and that this is an enormous problem. One way in which it's more difficult, I think, working on business and human rights issues than the stuff that I was doing before is that there is much less real consensus about what the standards actually are and what the human rights obligations of companies actually are. Most governments in the world today have some kind of meaningful regulation on paper about what companies are supposed to be doing within their own borders, but there's really no company, or there's no government that has any kind of remotely adequate legal framework for regulating or even making itself aware of what its companies are doing in other countries in human rights terms. So that leads to this situation where you have companies that are relatively responsible and companies that are much further at the wrong end of the spectrum, and there's really nothing anyone can do to hold any of them accountable if they're operating in contexts where the governments of the places where they're working aren't interested or don't have the capacity to do anything about it. Here I would say that by and large we really haven't yet, neither we nor anyone else has really had much success. And I guess in terms of trying to relate this to bigger trends and what's going on with the human rights movement, I think the single biggest dynamic that I think is actually important in terms of human rights issues as they relate to the business world is the until now complete failure of anyone to successfully advocate for real regulation and oversight of what companies are doing in human rights terms once they leave the borders of the places where they're headquartered. And we spent a lot of time in the last year actually specifically focused on Canada, partly because we had done research on a big gold mining company there, and that happened to sort of coincide with efforts to introduce some pretty modest government oversight of Canadian companies' human rights records. And that, it's a long story, but long story short, the whole thing fizzled and died in the face of implacable opposition from the industry, and due to sort of changing political winds that caused even the government and even companies to back away from some pretty minimal concessions that they had agreed to previously in the course of a couple of years of dialogue with civil society and government and a lot of other people. So I would say, by and large, it's there's a lot of people doing a lot of really good work, but if you want to point to concrete progress and sort of advancing standards, what we actually have is a world with a lot of really soft and sometimes meaningless voluntary initiatives that bring companies and governments and businesses together around, sort of agreed sets of norms, but no real way to enforce them, and a complete failure on the part of everybody, including us, to successfully push for better regulation, with a few maybe very tiny exceptions. On the part about Colombia, I guess, when I came here really hoping to do pretty much exactly what I ended up doing. And I remember that when I was applying for law school, it seemed like there were only 3 or 4 schools in the country that it made any sense to think about going to, and this was one of them, partly just because of it, the fact that the school is in New York, but it did actually seem like a place where, Peter talks about sort of mainstreaming of human rights at Columbia, and sort of sounds like from what you were saying that maybe this is less true now than it was then, but it definitely sort of had that feel about it. And while I'm not actually sure that I would have gone to law school at all if I'd known exactly what it was going to be like, but I still do tell people that if they're interested in doing human rights work and they want to go to law school, that you might as well go to Columbia. It's probably better than any place else. And I do think that there's a lot of things here to take advantage of, and that I certainly was able to take advantage of that a lot of other schools don't provide, from the Human Rights Internship Program, not just the money, but actually helping people find placements in what would otherwise be a pretty bewildering universe of potential options, to the clinic, which basically ended up occupying most of my 3rd year as I desperately tried to find excuses not to take other classes, to a range of other things, and I think that is something Columbia has always, or at least when I was here, did a lot better than other schools, and I hope that's still true and will continue to be true.
Thanks. I think most of those things are still true, so I probably gave too dour a view just to get started. Tiffany?
Good evening, everyone. I have a little bit of laryngitis, so let's hope we get through this. So I actually came to Columbia in 2005 as an LL.M. I had spent several years at Skadden Arps doing mergers and acquisitions, and my relationship to career in, I suppose, human rights had begun years before in South Africa, where I had worked at the TRC and did grassroots organizing in the townships. And so for me, in a lot of ways, going to Skadden was an aberration. I had a very liberal arts undergrad degree, did basically human rights, grassroots organizing work throughout undergrad and law school, and just began to see more increasingly this connection between the private sector and the public sphere, and felt like it would make sense for me to get some background in that, whether that was true or not is still, well, no, I think that is true actually. And so it was a particular moment in time for us as a nation, but for me personally, because that was the summer of 2005 before I entered that Hurricane Katrina happened. And my family is from the South, Alabama and Florida, and both of my parents grew up under the Jim Crow laws of the South. And in fact, my father grew up sharecropping in Alabama. And so I had a very personal, I'm sure we all had very strong reactions to what we saw, the images we saw during that time. And I had both a very personal and sort of in a way familiar response to that as well. And so I came to Columbia as an LL.M, having done mostly international work, And all the while I heard family and friends say, well, we got problems here at home. You're running to Cambodia, we got problems here at home. That was sort of the mantra I kept hearing. And after Hurricane Katrina, I said, we got problems here at home. So I knew I wanted to be involved in that work in some kind of way, but just didn't know how that would happen. And I should also take a step back and say that I'm a believer, I'm a Christian. And so a large part of what I do is out of liberation theology. So what you say to the least of these, the widows and the orphans. And so that's where I really ground my work in. And so I was just in prayer about where the Lord had me to go. And I found Peter, and I found him. And I literally found him right after I left SCAD, and I went to Cambodia to do some work. And I was on, the law school's website, and had heard some rumblings about this guy named Peter uptown, and saw his bio. I don't know if you remember that. And I emailed him from Phnom Penh saying, hey, I'm going to be at Columbia LL.M. I got to get into your clinic. And that's where our relationship began. And so I did a ton of interesting work while here. I got a chance to do some corporate social responsibility work here in terms of helping to evaluate the foreign direct investment.
I have to say that in the first conversation we had about Cambodia, I was so overwhelmed because one of the things we don't realize, most of us, is that there have been a fair number of Cambodians who grew up in the United States, who grew up in a sort of black-identified gang world and who have been deported back to Cambodia. And Tiffany connected with all of them, and among others, in a kind of black is beautiful awareness in Cambodia, of all places. Black awareness in Cambodia.
He loves to tell that story about me. This is true. It's all true. We started an organization called Black is Beautiful in Cambodia. And so I have been doing work with the clinic, largely in Liberia, assisting the government to renegotiate its foreign direct investment contracts with big organizations like Firestone, Mittal Still. And that was just powerful and transformative for me in a lot of ways. And then Peter really allowed me to sort of cut my teeth on what was a great way for me to sort of combine my corporate practice experience with real life human rights issue. So at that point, I figured, I got Katrina on my mind, and I'm here at Columbia, and I figured, well, I really would love to find a way to think about how to do economic social rights here in this country. And so I literally Googled that, and several organizations came up, and one of which was NESRI, the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative. And I see Alice Henkin's about to leave, so I do want to give her a shout out because I love what she said earlier. But also, I know that you're a new board member at NESRI, and unfortunately, our time didn't. We weren't there at the same time, but it's an honor to have you here. And so I found NESRI and literally emailed the founder, who's a Columbia Law grad as well, and went and met with her. And we figured that there would be some place for me in the organization if we just sort of think it through. And several months elapsed, and I did some other corporate social responsibility stuff. And Kathy, the ED, said, okay, we got some money, come on in. And I happily accepted. And I was originally placed as the legal program director and the director for their Hurricane Katrina project. So here I am doing the work that I just felt pulled and called to do. And so I went down to the Gulf Coast of the U.S., particularly New Orleans, Mississippi, and some other places. And the more I went down there and met with the impacted communities, the more I said, there are a ton of issues in this Gulf Coast area of our country, but one that keeps coming up and bubbling up for me is housing. And at that point, we had a program on education, on health, but not on housing. And no offense to anyone out there that does housing work, but the last thing I wanted to do was housing, because they just always seem crazy to me. And now that I've done housing, I know why they're crazy. So I said, okay, I really don't want to do housing work, but Kathy, we gotta have a housing program, because that's honestly just where the need was. We had the other areas covered. And so we went to our board, and they graciously accepted my proposal, and I created a housing program, human right to housing program, and became the director of it. And I guess just a few sort of takeaways from that, and sort of how that interacts with the global human rights field is one way is that at NESRI, our model is, and our strong philosophy is that you have to work with those on the ground, directly impacted communities. And so how do you give them agency and support their ongoing campaigns? And so I worked all over New Orleans. I continued to work in New Orleans, but then I also worked with communities in Chicago, LA, New York, Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, Wilkes Barre, Pennsylvania, really trying to help them to think through these issues of displacement, push out, both in public housing, which was the big fight in New Orleans. After the storm, once you had the mandatory evacuation, the government decided that since the poor folk were gone, it was a great time to basically demolish the public housing. And that was happening all across the country, poor communities being literally kicked out of their homes and their homes being demolished. But then you also had the foreclosure crisis that was happening, affecting, lower income, but mainly more middle income people. And what do we say about these predatory practices that are being meted out by our government through agencies such as HUD and other departments? And so I continued that work, and I think we had some victories, but it's sort of a long road to sort of travel. We were able in 2009 to get the UN Special Rapporteur on Housing to make an official U.S. visit to this country, and it was quite amazing in that this was our first time visiting the U.S. And back to that philosophy of ours, we made sure that she did meet with some advocates, she did meet with some lawyers, but we made sure, now I was the one who mainly facilitated her mission along with someone from another organization, and we were very keen to make sure that she went to the actual communities where folks were suffering. So I had her in the Bronx meeting with Picture the Homeless, a phenomenal grassroots organization doing, homeless advocacy work. I had her in Chicago meeting with people in Cabrini Green. From those of you of a certain generation, you may remember Good Times, and that was sort of the housing project the Good Times was based on, is Cabrini Green, and that was being demolished as we spoke. She went there. She went to New Orleans, of course. She went to Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and then she also went to LA to Skid Row and some other places in between. And it was very transformative for the folks on the ground to be able to speak directly to the UN about what they were facing, and also about what they saw as possible responses to what they were facing. And so fast forward, we also did a ton of work internationally. There's a huge, and this talks about, I think, the second point that Peter asked us, where do we see the human rights movement going? So in this work, here I am, a Columbia Law grad at this point, working with poor, marginalized communities, and learning a ton from them. And I think I learned more about human rights working with them than in any other highfalutin place that I've ever saw myself in. And as I said, I was at the TRC, I worked at the UN, and honestly, this is where I saw human rights in a real practical way. I think these people, and I think it says it, right? Those who have no rights believe in rights the most, or those who don't know justice believe in justice the most. So these were the people who, back to Lou Henkin, a lot of my allies on the ground carried the Universal Declaration in their pockets. That's what they did. And so they really showed me really what it means to really believe in human rights and advocate for it. And then they began to build linkages with poor people across the world, from Thailand to South African shack dwellers. So in Hungary, there's this very dynamic human right to housing movement happening. And I see that's where human rights is going, is that those who are on the ground, those who are directly impacted, those who are voiceless, using these mechanisms, these principles, these ideals, and advocating for them. And I think that in terms of where Columbia fits into all of that, honestly, what I've been telling students as I'm sort of advising them on their careers is that at some point, if you're serious about having a career in human rights, I strongly urge you to get on the ground at some point. Whatever issue area you want to get into, you got to know what it looks like, what it smells like, and how people are being impacted by it before you kind of get up here and speak about it. And that's sort of, I'm sure there's other things we can think about, but that's just a strong message that I'd like to give you, is that, really think about getting that on the ground, grassroots experience with those who are directly impacted.
Tiffany is doing the advising that Chris was saying has been so important now at this point of advising, because she's taking time away from the full-time human rights world and working with Columbia for the social justice initiatives, which is a great opportunity for us. So thank you, Tiffany. Paola?
Hi, my name is Paola, and I'm an Argentinian lawyer. I came here in 2009 and did my LL.M, and I joined the clinic. Before that, I've been working in an NGO in Argentina called CELS, Center for Legal and Social Studies. And this NGO basically was created in 1979, where in Argentina we face a very huge dictatorship between the 76 and 83, and during those years we usually we use the international framework and human rights framework to make to basically show to the entire world what was going on in our country. And I remember I was not born at that point, but I remember our founders talk about how important was the U.S. and allies here in the U.S. to break the walls of silence that were building in our country, and to let people know and how important was actually to have the help and the assistance of the international community for our country, where people living inside claimed not to know about what was going on with people who were disappearing, and our authoritative government was in charge. And I remember how Amnesty or the Bar Association or the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights came to our country during those years to do fact findings and to try to again spread the voice about what was going on in our country. So at some point, Argentina started to be immersed in this human rights world and using this human rights language since at least the late 70s. So at some point it's, how to explain this, when I came here, I came with like a huge historical background on human rights. I went to law school knowing what human rights was, having like tons of courses about human rights, and really having an important like historical background again on human rights. And I came here and I found myself trying to, or being challenged about why economic and social rights were not enforceable, or why the US was guided by their own constitution but not necessarily by human rights treaties. And that was like really challenging for me, because I usually took for granted so many discussions about the human rights world and how I usually impose the human rights language in so many discussions, and again it was really a huge I did a huge effort to have those conversations again and try again to challenge or not to take for granted so many assumptions that I had. At CELS I used to work a lot with communities, and I think at some point that's some of the great values of using international litigation that allows me to work in so many different levels, like working with these huge faraway tribunals here in the US or in Costa Rica or in other countries, and speaking this language of standards and human rights and with sophisticated words and discourse and technical discourses. But also being capable of working in the ground, of working with real people, with communities, hearing like true stories about their lives, and trying to combine those discourses. Both discourses have been a real challenge. But also I had the chance to work with the government, and that has been also really important and challenging. I mean, this is like a third actor who was part of this conversation, not only international bodies, not only the communities or victims, but also the government that at the end of the day is the one who will at some point recognize and implement all these rights. So at some point again I found myself, it's going to be kind of like inappropriate, but having fun, really working on the human rights field, litigating before international fora, even if we were dealing with awful stories and awful human rights violations. I think that part of why I was committed to do this work and why I was really engaged in doing this work is because I also took the nice part of it. I mean, against this possibility of having fun when I was working with those awful cases. But well, when I came here to Colombia, I was really afraid of being, studied in a room for hours and hours without having the opportunity to be in touch with people, to lose all that interaction and kind of like touch of reality. And that's why I decided to join the clinic. I learned at some point that LL.Ms were not necessarily allowed to join the clinic, and so I was pretty disappointed, because one of the reasons why I chose Colombia was the strong background about the human rights clinic and other clinics, and so where I think I lobby Peter and Carrie to just have the chance to be part of the clinic.
It was the other way around, Carrie. I thought we actually commissioned you to come to school here on being part of it.
I think it was a little bit of a conspiracy against me and Paola.
Well, so they say that I was not allowed.
American Commission expert.
Yeah. So basically, and I'm grateful that I did that. I think that at some point in the experience of working on cases while I was studying, and it was unique. I mean, combining the theoretical approach with more empirical approach was unique here, and Colombia gave me that opportunity, and it was amazing. I must say that the first approach to the clinic was basically trying to work on a case on mass expulsion in Dominican Republic and Haiti. And I was like, oh God, this is what I didn't want to do, right? But just come here to the US and work on human rights abroad, just bring human rights to other countries and not necessarily discussing what was going on here in the country. But I can be more grateful about having the chance to do that, to understand that if you work with communities on the ground, if you really engage in what is going on in the ground and not necessarily having this paternalistic approach on the cases and on the people, that can really help other communities outside the US. And so again, really grateful. And I also learned something. I learned about them bringing human rights movement, which I think at some point someone said, I can't remember who actually, this, why bringing human rights at home? I mean, human rights have been always here, why doing that? And I was shocked about the name of this network as well, but I think that the word, you want to say
the work that we've done, we started on human rights in the United States, was called the Bringing Human Rights Home Project.
Okay.
Which still exists, although it's been so unwieldy, we find it now. We now call it Human Rights in the United States.
Okay. Yeah. But it used to be.
But it's still, the network is still there.
Again, I lost track. But basically, I learned also that there was a huge movement, an increasing movement here in the U.S. trying to work on issues that were taking place here, that there were severe human rights violations also here in the U.S., and there were movements and acknowledging that. And I think that Colombia provide with like a platform actually to combine all those things that I was talking about like before, right? This like more theoretical academic approach to discuss and to sophisticate if that is a word or whatever, to sophisticate the discussion, but it also provides with tools and elements to work with people on the ground and to engage with community and to have that connection with real people and real stories, and at the same time they have you have a strong political voice to go and discuss things with the government. Probably you are granted meetings with the government that no one else and grassroots movements may not have, and so I think that again this is like a unique platform for doing so, and I think that you should take advantage of that and actually promote even more this conversation among all these actors.
Thank you. So finally, Ramzi.
Hey everyone. Well, I'd like to begin by thanking Professor Rosenblum, Professor Cleveland, Greta Moses, and Tarek Ismail, and everyone else at the Institute for inviting me and having us all here. And I think I found a new nickname for Peter. And now I'll call him Uptown Peter. Use that. So When I was, do they still have the HRIP sort of summer fellowships for students at Columbia to do international human rights work?
Actually, it's all students have guaranteed summer funding, and the HRIP is something on top of that Tiffany's been working with.
So when I was in the summer of my first year, thanks to one of those fellowships, I was able to go to Haiti, and I spent about 4 months working in Haiti, funded by Columbia. That was the summer of 2001, and it's sort of. I want to share with you a joke, or maybe it's, I don't know if it's a saying or a joke that someone told me when I was there. And it intervened at like a very, I guess, appropriate moment in my life. And it was something along the lines of, how do you make, and this was, the context for this was I was working with a local NGO in Haiti called the National Coalition for Haitian Rights. And we were out in a rural, secluded area trying to identify the families of Haitian workers who had been gunned down by the Dominican military while they were attempting to cross the border to find work in the Dominican Republic. And so NCHR was trying to identify their families. And so we were in a very secluded rural area, and we were spending the night on a farmer's land. And I don't know how this came up in the conversation, but at one point, the farmer who's hosting us turns to me and says, how do you make God laugh? And so, I'm playing along, I'm like, how? And he goes, well, tell him about your plans.
Tell him about
your plans. Tell him about your plans. And so, at that point in my life, I was a rising 2L at Columbia, and I had come to Columbia with this idea, this sort of vague idea that I wanted to do something human rights related, and that I wanted to eventually work on rule of law related issues in countries like the ones where I had grown up, and I had grown up mostly in the Middle East. And so that was my notion. And I came to Columbia because it had a strong sort of international law, human rights law reputation, and because it was a school where I'd be able to do to participate in the double degree program with the Sorbonne. And again, the idea to me was, okay, I would get a JD and get some foundation in the Anglo-American common law system, and then I'd go to France and get some training in the civil legal system, which is the basis for most countries' legal systems. And from there, I'd be able to sort of do what I had set out to do. And so I'm in Haiti, sort of thinking that I'm taking steps towards that end, and I hear this joke. And I really didn't know, how close I was to the moment in my life where, things would turn in a way that would have been impossible for me to predict. And by that I mean, I had set out thinking that I would do rule of law work, mostly overseas, internationally, and if you'd asked me then, I would have never guessed that I would have ended up doing rule of law work here in the United States. And here's sort of how it happened. I came back from Haiti and I started my second year, and that's when 9/11 happened. And it was it was local, it was very personal to me. I knew people who worked down there, and it was a double tragedy for me. On one level, the primary level, as a New Yorker, as an American, someone living here, someone who knew people who worked in that neighborhood, in those buildings. That was sort of the primary tragedy. And then the secondary tragedy was, the ways in which that event transformed, my life. And not just sort of in this country or in this city, but also at Columbia. In the sense that, alliances were all of a sudden, shifted, realigned. Spaces that had felt comfortable for me as a student here were all of a sudden less comfortable, and also in the larger reaction in our city and in our country to those events. And pretty much, immediately, maybe the week after 9/11 or 2 weeks after 9/11, I started working with the Center for Constitutional Rights and the ACLU, who at that point were simply trying to identify the hundreds of men. At this point we know it was 1,200, but the hundreds of immigrants from Muslim-majority countries who had been rounded up by the authorities and sent to various immigration and criminal detention sites in the tri-state area. And so I, as a law student, as a 2L, I volunteered and worked with lawyers at both of those organizations to visit those sites and try to identify the prisoners, because at that point, the government's position was that, their names were not releasable. And so, the primary task was just to sort of figure out who was being held and why. And so that sort of set me off on a slightly different path from the one that I had anticipated, and it gave me an interest in the human rights impacts domestically and internationally of counterterrorism policies after 9/11. Now I did go to Paris, but I kept on sort of following with very closely with great interest legal and political developments related to counterterrorism in the post 9/11 era. And when I came back here, my first job was actually in criminal law. It was a public interest fellowship that I got to do exoneration, post-exoneration work. And that was also sort of an unanticipated development in my life because, again, I had come here seeking out human rights experience, but finding myself more drawn to sort of criminal law curriculum. And by the time I was done with law school, I figured, well, I should probably get some experience with that. And at the same time, I was still, deeply drawn to what had happened here and internationally after 9/11. And so 1 year into that job, I felt comfortable enough with my, criminal caseload to go to my supervisors and say, okay, can I take on sort of a case of a different sort pro bono on my own? And my idea was to volunteer to represent one of the Guantanamo prisoners. So this was in 2004, towards the end of 2004. And the Supreme Court had just issued its decision in Rasul and Hamdi's decisions in Rasul and Hamdi. And so there was an opening there for lawyers to play a part. And, I wanted to do that. And my supervisor said, sure, as long as you can handle your other cases, it's fine with us, but you're going to have to find a way to pay for it. Because it was a public interest placement. I was living in New York on like 30 or 40 grand, and they didn't have the means to underwrite it. And so I had to find some other source of funding for it. And it's funny, actually, I was having this conversation this morning with a group of students from the Native American Law Students Association, which is an association I was a member of when I was a student here. And they invited me this morning to speak to them about, sort of careers in public interest. And I told them that my experience taught me that you have to be extremely obstinate and persistent about your goals and your passions, the things that you want to do, the areas that you want to work in, but you can't be that rigid, and you have to be extremely flexible about the path that may take you there. And so I knew that I wanted to do a certain type of work, a certain type of human rights litigation domestically, but I was trying to figure out a way to get there. And so my job wasn't going to be able to finance that sort of work, and so I went and I tried about a dozen different ways to find a placement or a source of funding for the work, and I failed a dozen different ways. I shopped myself out to legal NGOs, to law firms who were doing that work, to private practitioners, and I offered barters and quid pro quos, and none of that worked out. And then randomly one night I was at a party of all places, and so this was kind of funny because the takeaway for the folks that I met with this morning in NALSA was to go to bars. That's what they took from my little talk. But so I was at a party and I met this guy, and we were talking about he sort of shared an interest in this stuff, and the conversation came to Guantanamo, and he said, "Oh wow, if you're interested in this, I'm a law student in my third year at Fordham Law School. I'm in the criminal defense clinic. My professor is thinking about taking on some Guantanamo cases. Do you want to come and chat with us?" So I was like, all right. I went over there, met with his professor, Martha Rayner, who still teaches at Fordham Law School. And at the end of like a 2-hour conversation, she said, okay, you're interested in this work. Why don't you co-counsel with me? The law school will underwrite our litigation expenses, traveling and whatnot. and maybe we can have you as an adjunct sort of co-teach the seminar. And I didn't, at that point in my life, I never really thought of myself as someone who was headed towards teaching, but, it seemed like a way for me to do this kind of work. And so in the process, I discovered not only that I really enjoyed the work, which was not so much a surprise, but that I enjoyed teaching as well, that I enjoyed teaching clinically. And that's what sort of got me where I am today, doing work on these kinds of issues. My one...
Can you say a word about what the work is that you are doing now?
Well, right now with my students, actually it's expanded in a great many ways from that original project. So with my students, I continue... So since then, I taught at Fordham, at Yale, and now I teach at the City University of New York. And my students and colleagues, we represent, on the one hand, Guantanamo and Bagram prisoners before the military commissions at Guantanamo and before federal, appellate and district courts. And sort of on another end of what I view as a single spectrum or continuum, we also work on more domestic counterterrorism concerns and policies. And so, for example, we run rights awareness projects throughout the city. We do coalition support work for grassroots organizations that are advocating and organizing around these issues, around the impacts that are felt by Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, mostly in post 9/11 New York. And we also do a lot of direct representation work where we represent folks who aren't charged criminally and so don't have appointed counsel and don't have the means to afford counsel because they're from mostly immigrant working class communities, but have been approached by the FBI and the NYPD for what's known as voluntary questioning. And there's sort of a timely topic now with the Associated Press confirming that there was a massive NYPD surveillance program targeting Muslim communities in New York City, where they basically had files on bookshops, mosques, libraries, etc. So pretty much every level of Muslim public life in the city. And so we're engaged in that full spectrum of post 9/11 counterterrorism work. And so, I think, just to end on a note that's hopefully responsive to one of the questions that Peter put to us, my hope for where Columbia's human rights program can go. As an alum, I've always been proud of Columbia's presence on the international human rights scene. I think it's indisputable that Columbia alums are everywhere and that they're involved in every level of international human rights work. And that's something that I hope the school will continue to sort of promote and make possible. But an additional aspiration, to my mind, would be for the law school and its human rights program, broadly writ, to perhaps increase its focus on the domestic scene, sort of to sharpen its gaze inwards at human rights here in the United States. And I know that there's already a commitment to do that, and I know that Peter has moved that forward significantly. But I hope that we'll get to a place where the law school is as known for that sort of side of human rights work as it is for the international part.
Thanks very much. I have some questions, but let's see whether people in the audience also have some questions, if anyone would like to start by asking. One of the great things that as I listen to the panelists, what's really very exciting for us is that much of this resonates with what we are doing now with the Human Rights Institute, with the clinic. For those of you who haven't been around in recent times, you'd probably be surprised to know that we have 5 lawyers working with the Human Rights Institute. Among them, Risa Kaufman, the executive director, working on human rights in the United States primarily, Joanne Kemeth-Ward as well, on traditional issues perhaps of human rights in the sense that what we might define as the international human rights agenda and how the U.S. complies with it or does not, working on shadow reports, reporting to committees and others. And then we also have Noreen Shah, who's been with us a couple of years working on counterterrorism and human rights, particularly on U.S. and warfare issues, drone warfare. And in part because of Ramzi, I think, and his interest in collaborating, we've also been able to expand, and we have Tariq Ismail this year working with us on a project that relates as well to Muslim communities and is intimately connected. I don't think we could do it if there weren't. We wouldn't think of doing it if we didn't know that there were lawyers in the community engaged directly and willing to collaborate. So that's been part of what's enabled us to do that. And our only other lawyer actually working in the projects with us now is Netta Patrick. They're working on a project outside the United States, is Netta Patrick, on a project that has to do with housing rights in the occupied territories in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And we've been able to benefit recently, especially from Tiffany and her experience with housing rights. So it's quite it's in terms of a changed world, at least within the Human Rights Institute and the clinic. I think it reflects the trends in terms of moving away from the more traditional work outside the United States on human rights, working instead inside, working on economic and social rights, working on issues of business and human rights. Some of the work that Chris has done in this area on the economic intersection with human rights, I think, has really been critical. Even before he went into the business and human rights section of Human Rights Watch, the work that he did on Nigeria related to transparency and local financing of local government was really trend-setting in terms of human rights. And our clinic, it's perhaps one of the other major areas in which we work has been the global economy and working in terms of business. So I guess I would ask you whether you see this, I mean, it's part of what each of you have addressed in part, but maybe if you could come back to it. What is the human rights movement today? And are you a part of it? Are you a fringe within it? Are you a major component? Or is it really the part of the pleasure that we no longer have to think in terms of a small colony of people labeled human rights within this work?
Everyone's pointing to someone else in this whole process. Is no one willing to dive in?
Have more time to think about it.
I mean, maybe each of you are coming from a slightly different perspective in terms of professional human rights or an organization, a funded organization. I know that the salaries at Mesri were kind of non-existent as salaries in terms of and the guarantees of security in terms of a long-term job. Human Rights Watch is probably somewhat above that in terms of having a career track within human rights that looks like something, but maybe seen as the elites, it might be a different story.
I mean, I can take a crack at the question, maybe from my narrow perspective, right, sort of the counterterrorism and human rights perspective. And I think, what's interesting is that, I tried to talk about, the work that I do as being on as being on a single continuum, right, sort of spanning the more domestic manifestations of post 9/11 counterterrorism policies all the way to the extraterritorial ones like Guantanamo, Bagram, and the Black sites. And the reason I always stress that point is because when I first started doing this work, the view was that there was there was a cleavage between folks who were interested in, the Guantanamo side of things, were viewed as, perhaps, human rights or rule of law advocates, however you want to put it, and then, or like national security litigators, and then the folks who were looking at the more domestic dimension, who were viewed as, perhaps civil rights advocates or, defense lawyers here domestically. And the bridges and the connections were seldom made, at least at first. And there wasn't much of a view that they were all a part of a single human rights movement. And so what's interesting now in 2011, and I think you, Peter, and the Institute have played a very important role in sort of bridging those divides and creating a perception among many of the actors all along that continuum that they're engaged in a common and joint endeavor. And I'm referring to a series of meetings, for example, that you've held here, bringing together people from different parts of that small world or subculture in a way that has enabled them to recognize the commonalities that have always been there, but just were never highlighted. And so I think today, in 2011, again, for folks working on, post 9/11 counterterrorism, national security type issues, there's much more of a perception that we're all engaged in a common human rights endeavor domestically and in the United States. And that wasn't the case, 6 years ago. So I think, I guess now I would say, yes, there's a recognition that we're part of a movement and that it has connections to human rights and to the larger human rights movement. But getting to that point was in and of itself a battle. And hopefully we won't lose sight of that commonality.
Chris, you mentioned that you mentioned maybe it was in passing almost that you actually have more influence sometimes with corporations, and we've talked about this work that you did on Barrett Gold and how Human Rights Watch is powerful enough to open up doors, and in that way the reputational interest of the company responds. And as you mentioned in the case of your Barrett research, actually others labeled as human rights had tried to do that research before, including the Harvard Law School's clinic. It makes me wonder, well, is this just the power of Human Rights Watch, or is it the power of a human rights idea that still works? Are you working for just a powerful organization that's otherwise acting on its own, that's, you say, you're not finding the support in the building of the community, at least around the business and human rights issues?
I think, in a really general sense, I think the relationship between human rights, or the relationship of Human Rights Watch to the broader human rights movement is kind of a weird one, and one that, is different in different situations. We tend to be the people in the room who are holding the megaphone, and in part that's deserved, and in part it often isn't. But we have a good relationship to the broader human rights movement to the extent that we're saying the same things that they're trying to say. But I think there are a lot of other situations where there are a lot of people who sort of feel like we drown them out to the extent that we're saying something different or saying something that they don't agree with. And I think that's sort of there's a lot of frustration and resentment towards us and the other kind of really big organizations out there for just that reason. And as far as the business and human rights stuff goes, I think it's an even more strange dynamic, because I think in many ways, we're actually trying to do something different from what a lot of the groups and activists who do human rights work related to business are doing. I think, much more so than is true in a lot of other contexts. A lot of the people who frankly, a lot of the NGOs and a lot of the activists who do business and human rights work are really just people who don't like business. A lot of the people who work on the mining industry and are sort of looking at, irresponsible mining practices are really just people who would like to see the industry stop. A lot of the people who work on sort of land rights issues relating to indigenous communities and new industrial development projects are really just people who, would like to see a world where those communities are just left alone and completely untouched by all of this activity. And we sort of come at it from a very different angle, which I think is a good thing, but a lot of other people don't. And I think we, particularly in this field, we see ourselves as trying to be more objective than maybe others are, and more actually sort of focused on what the standards are, as opposed to a broader kind of set of beliefs that may or might not be fully grounded in actual kind of human rights principles. But I think a lot of other people see us as kind of being, maybe a little bit conservative, maybe a little bit too close to the companies, or too, sort of smarmy in gaining access to them and stuff like that. So it's a good and a bad relationship, but I think it would be a bit of a stretch to just say that we are seamlessly a part of it, even though we're, obviously entangled with it in a lot of ways, good and bad.
Paola, you described, in terms of Argentina, a world where you grew up in a world where human rights was a common vocabulary, but at the same time, economic and social rights in Latin America has not been as easily accepted as part of this bigger corpus. And in Argentina, the human rights story itself now enters another generation of those now coming back to questions of what happened during the dictatorship and whether there's going to be accountability for those rights. And I don't know whether you have a comment on the broader movement from the perspective of Argentina, or whether also it relates to your way of encountering the United States. Did the United States seem strangely parochial and outside of an international conversation about human rights, or did you see it as actually as connected in more ways?
Well, yeah, at some point you are right. And I think in terms, I'm more familiarized with the human rights movement in the region in Latin America, so it's easier for me to talk about that because I think it's like huge human rights movement, right? But I would say that yes, that historically in the region the human rights movement was identified with this transition from authoritarian governments to democratic regimes, and so that was the agenda basically of the human rights movement. I do believe that now, even if we, for example, in the case of Argentina, we are continuing struggling with what happened in the past, and now we are judging all the dictators, and so the trials are taking place currently after 30 years of the dictatorship. Even if that is happening right now, we think that the human rights movements have grown during these years and bringing a more actual agenda, like more democratic agenda, and the question about economic and social rights, but also other civic and political rights have been part of the agenda of the movements. With more successful or less successful stories, but I think that in general, countries in the region have been increasingly acquiring this language for these other rights. I must say also that I do believe that within the region there is kind of like a backlash about this human rights language. That is happening right now in Argentina. We were like, again, as I was saying, we were immersed in this human rights discourse and language for 30 years now. And I think that now there are like really counter reactions to that there's like, it's being probably because the past is coming back again, but I think there have been very profound reactions in general in the region related to the human rights, maybe bringing this issue of like how opportunistic is the human rights movement and from the very beginning. And so it's difficult to talk on the human rights movement outside Latin America, but I think that we are in a scenario in which the human rights movement have to reinvent themselves or readjust the discourse in order to legitimize their work in these other agendas. I think that nobody can actually argue things related to mass crimes against humanity, genocide. I mean, those big words, very famous within the human rights movement. But I think that the tools that were used to use for those kind of like violations have been shown not to be that successful on these other problems that have raised more recently, and so yeah, it's kind of like an awkward situation right now in which I think the movement has been losing some kind of like legitimacy in what they have been working on.
You may have already covered this area. I mean, describing your own encounter with human rights and grassroots awareness here in the United States. So, you'd like to add?
I'll probably just repeat myself, but I think mainly in terms of your question about sort of where are we with human rights? Are there, where is the field? Where is it going? And this is just in my sort of limited perspective of the work that I've been doing over the past, several years. But I guess it's going in different places. But the aspect of the work that I find, for me, the most exciting and the most energetic, and that what speaks to me is, as I said, what's happening on the ground, and not just in this country, but around the world. There's just an energy there and a real belief in the possibility of change and social justice through human rights that in other incarnations of my human rights career I didn't find. I think Paola, you were speaking to this in terms of the cynicism that can be created. And I've also worked in places like that as well. I don't find that on the ground. I find it also to be much more creative. No one's really quoting chapter and verse of the Universal Declaration necessarily, but the ways in which they're using those same principles to agitate and advocate for rights is very creative and inspiring. And then also I find this very dynamic cross-national solidarity building that's taken place. And it's largely, beyond race, beyond ethnicity, and it's really class. So you have, folks in Hungary, Europe, banding together with folks in, the favelas in Brazil, banding together with the public housing residents of Chicago, supporting, the shack builders in South Africa. And as I was saying when I first started the work at Nesri around domestic housing rights issues, one of the first things that I wanted to do was get my allies and my partners out of the U.S. because that's where I had begun my work. And I said, there's a lot happening out there that we're not connected to in the U.S. just because we don't really be connected to them. And just by way of example, when we went to Brazil for the UN World Forum on Housing and Development, as soon as you have poor folks from communities in this country get together with folks in the favelas in Brazil, not a whole lot of explanation had to happen because they got it and they knew the lived experience. And so by and large, as I said, I think movement is happening and hopefully change is happening in various sort of levels of the movement. But what I find the most interesting and dynamic is what's taking place on the ground.
So looking out there, I see a lot of people who have come in along the way, or people who are here, alumni who are, and others who are working in human rights, and I think probably have experiences themselves. And maybe the best thing we can do now is to break from this formal setting. We'll be having the reception at 5:30, and we'll be expecting a group that'll be coming in also to talk about Jessica Gonzalez, and with Jessica herself to talk about it. And I look forward to the continuing conversations that we can have here in this room and outside the room and online and elsewhere. But I do want to stress that we are committed to this vision. And I'm enthusiastic about what we're able to do, but more so about what our graduates are doing now in the world. That gives us a sense, I think, that there's really a strength and a power left in that we haven't yet pursued. So let me thank the panelists and thank everybody in the audience. Look forward to talking.